Great to have practitioners joining us today. So we'll go ahead and get started just because I want to make sure that our presenters have their full amount of time to share with us their learning and their experience related to virtual communities of practice. So I am pleased to introduce ourselves just very quickly. This webinar is being put on by RISE. Our mission is to disrupt systemic inequality in America's schools by building individual and team capacity to tackle race and racism, and supporting the use of improvement tools, practices, and examples to help schools, districts, and charter management organizations promote diversity, equity, and true integration. So by true integration, we really distinguish between the act of just getting diverse students in the building, which we call desegregation, and really expanding upon and building upon their experience so that they have access to what we call the ABCDs. The A stands for rigorous academic preparation, the B stands for belongingness, the C is a commitment to dismantling racism and oppression, and the D is an appreciation of diversity. And so we work to and aim to create schools where students all have access to these four elements. And in that case, we consider them to be truly integrated. And what we also do is work across different levels of the educational system. And so here on the systemic improvement map, we always think about the classroom. We always think about the impact on our students. But outside of the classroom, we know that there are systems that support that strong classroom experience, including leadership, systems and structures, families and communities, and culture. And I think today's topic really touches upon the connection between leadership and teaching and systems and structures that can be put into place to best cultivate the teacher's capacity to really implement practices in his or her classroom that make a difference for our students. And so I'm really thrilled today to present our two webinar speakers. Amy Jiravisitcul is the data and evaluation manager for the Diverse Charter School Coalition. As an educator, Amy consistently sought out institutions that prioritized educational equity. Although she grew up in a predominantly white suburb of Connecticut, her parents, who arrived in the US during the 1980s as refugees from Southeast Asia. Amy's K-12 experience in this white-centric public school system sparked her passion for disrupting generational legacies of systemic racism, colonialism, and trauma among marginalized communities. She's formerly served on the board of directors for Asian American Resource Workshop, supported neighborhood-based organizing, and fighting anti-Black racism. Her background also includes teaching foreign language at the elementary and middle school level, as well as advising underserved students and families in a Boston out-of-school time academic program. Seon Britton is the program manager and for membership engagement, also at the Diverse Charter School Coalition. Seon is a product of two first-generation college students of the civil rights era. He comes from Detroit, Michigan. Moving to the suburbs at the age of 7 was an early lesson for Seon on how resources are distributed to communities of color versus white communities. His experiences growing up made him a strong believer of equity, in which he chose to work within the education sector, teaching 6th grade reading in Arkansas as a Teach for America Corps member. After this, he focused on finding great teachers for students by recruiting for TFA and later the New York City Department of Education under NYC Men Teach. Seon currently lives in New York City, and when not working on school integration, he is perfecting his expertise on classic Black 90s sitcoms through Netflix. That was the fun part of the bio. I didn't read Amy's fun part of the bio, so I am actually going to go back and read that part. In Amy's free time, she enjoys discussing racial identity development, making pizza dough from scratch, and getting lost in everyone's Instagram stories. So now you have both their professional part of the bio and also the fun part of the bio. So it's my privilege to transition over to Amy, who's going to get us started.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Candace. I feel like that's the first time I heard those stories out loud because we wrote them a while ago, so that's funny. All right, let me get my screen up. Just a second. Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. So yeah, after that introduction, I really want to hear from the group. So I do have an opening question, and I'll give you a space to type out your response. But in the framework of thinking about like adult learning and what that has been like, I'm curious to hear what skills or practices you all have learned in the past year that might apply to your work beyond the pandemic era. So take a second to think about that. And Seon just dropped in the chat a link to where you can answer it. So you'll click on the link, or if you want to text a number, you can do that too. And yeah, you can put your name or remain anonymous, but I'd love to hear yeah, what people have been thinking about in terms of skills or practices learned in the past year. Whew. Ooh, breathing and listening. That's a good one, a good skill. You think it's, you know, comes naturally, but it's good to practice. Leaning into discomfort. Ooh, so many feelings. Yes, I agree with that completely. Oh. All right, and yeah, I know there's like a few people on the call, so I hope we get to see everyone's, but yeah, flexibility, being adapting in the moment, awesome. And if we didn't get to see yours, but you think of a really good one later, definitely share it in the chat. So we'll have it forever. Great, thanks for everyone for engaging in that question. I think it's funny to think about, yeah, how the pandemic era is traumatic in a lot of ways, but also like, at the same time pushing this different type of learning and skill growth that's different from other non-pandemic times. Cool. So I want to talk just really quickly about the objectives for the session today. I want us to, as a group, examine key elements of a community of practice and considerations for developing one. And I'd love to share kind of how our community of practice this year, one of the groups on trauma-informed practices to support all students, how that's kind of unfolded among the diverse by design public charter school leaders in our membership. So I'll pass it off to Seon to just give an overview of the coalition.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Amy. Before we dive into today's session, I just want to give some context to who we are, Diverse Charter Schools Coalition as an organization. The first thing, you'll see our mission on this slide here, but with that, we are at the focus of our work. It is giving support to school leaders of diverse by design schools, or schools that are intentionally integrated. So when thinking of diverse by design or intentional integration, we're thinking of schools, you know, from the ground up at all levels. How are DEI practices being infused from the hiring of teachers, the recruitment of students, the budgeting? Are you budgeting bus to then, you know, to transport those students from different zip codes? But from the foundation of the school and in the school's planning, curriculum, everything, how is that DEI focused there? So that is the work that we do with all of our members, which we'll talk a little bit more about. On the next slide, which gives a little bit more information on our vision and values, I want to talk about how we are approaching this vision of diverse by design schools, or schools that are intentionally integrated. And that's through the major programming that we give to all of our members. So that first is our annual convening. Each year, we host an annual meeting of our members for them to come to learn from one another, to share out sort of best practices and also challenges that they've had. The majority of attendees, as well as session facilitators, are members, and then there are school visits as well of member schools there. So you can go to our website, look at our highlights page for this past year convening, but we had a really successful virtual convening that we have to do this year. I'm looking forward to being in KC in January of 2022. Our next programming is our Unify Ed program. And with this, while the majority of our work as an organization are with schools that are currently operating, our Unify Ed program works specifically to expand the diverse by design movement. So with that, one must be a DCSC member in order to be a host site. But for a year, that host site will host a Unify Ed School Launch Fellow. And after that year, that fellow can open up his or her own new standalone charter school that is diverse by design, or they can lead the expansion of the host site there, if that host site is going to grow. And then last but not least of our programming, in addition to the annual convening and the Unify Ed program, is our communities of practice, which Amy will get more into today, and which we'll do throughout the rest of this hour. And then on the next slide, just to leave with a brief history of the organization, DCSC, we were founded in 2014, and we started with 14 original founding member schools. And the first thing that I want to highlight, how this organization came about, it's from people doing this work. It is from school leaders, principals, CEOs, directors of diversity initiatives that came together to start this organization. And we have proudly grown to the 71 members that we have across the country now in 22 states in the DC. And that represents over 200 individual schools serving 80,000 plus students. And just to give a little overview, sort of what makes up our 71 membership base. The majority of our schools are single site, standalone diverse by design charter schools, one, maybe 2 or 3 sites, but then we do have some larger networks as well. So that makes the 200 plus individual schools that we have across the country. And within our 71 members, there's also a mix of models. We have dual language, EL, expeditionary learning, as well as Montessori schools. That's a few members that we have there as well. But with that, with the work that we are doing, once again, focus on schools that are already working towards intentional integration. We're looking forward to grow the movement of diverse by design charter schools, in which we as an organization, we have 2 membership application cycles. So we are currently in a membership application cycle. Our application is open, closing on April 30th. So if there are any schools that you think will be a good fit for our organization as you learn more about us over the course of the hour, please, get in touch with me as I think you'll have all of our information after this call. But with that, I hope that was, you got a good sense of, who we are as an organization. But I think this rest of this hour will really be more meaningful in regards to getting a deep dive of the work we actually do. So I'm going to pass that back over to Amy to talk more about our communities of practice.
Great, thanks, Seon. So as Seon mentioned, in addition to our convening and leadership support fellowship, we have our communities of practice. So this program is pretty young, I guess, in the history of the organization. And we're just finishing up our 2nd year. But our theory of action is if we are able to recruit and select facilitators, provide logistical support for sessions, and then support each group with developing a resource, then the public charter school leaders in our membership will be able to connect, grow their expertise, and bring justice to education. So that's the goal. And I think it really arose from members as we continue to grow each year, wanting to connect more with each other. I think especially in the charter school landscape and specifically intentionally integrated schools, a lot of school leaders describe that experience as kind of feeling like they're on an island without other folks to necessarily tap into or going through similar challenges. So we set up this program in a couple of ways. So when looking at the inputs, we have this ongoing conversation with each of our members, understanding what they need and what their priorities are, and trying to match those needs with our facilitators. So it's kind of a 2-pronged process that I outlined here on this slide, with us engaging with the member schools throughout the year and choosing the facilitators that best fit those needs. So we have a request for proposal and we have a selection committee, including input from the staff and reflections on conversations we've had with members. And we're able to promote signups among members throughout the summer months to continue to build that momentum. And I think when members sign on, they get particularly excited about this framework of continuous improvement. So kind of similar to the RIDES framework of that cycle of implementation, we are envisioning this type of cycle where facilitators are introducing a strategy, a framework, something to try. Participants are trying them out on site, whatever that looks like, because a lot of school is online kind of right now, and then learning from that, and whatever small experiments or small shifts in practice can happen, what we learn from that, and hopefully that leads to a continuous improvement in practice and ultimately outcomes for students. So yeah, those are our results. So this year we have 4 working groups representing more than 24 school sites with 68 individual practitioners across the 4 groups. And ultimately they serve more than 20,000 students in the pre-K-12 sector. So moving from there, I wanted to focus more closely on the community of practice related to trauma-informed practices. So we were connected to SELF, Aseret Takubo and Akua Stovall, the Special Education Leader Fellowship. And they are an organization, they have a lot of types of training programs and are really specialized in developing education leaders in the field of special education. So I think it was really helpful for us to get to learn from their expertise. A lot of our members had some existing connections with them already. And like I said, we put in the effort of finding the right folks, reviewing different proposals, and making sure that members throughout the summer months were aware that like their input influenced the way that we were able to have this topic rise to the forefront. Because I think especially in the era of the pandemic, trauma being more widespread, this seemed like a high priority topic to touch into. So in their group, they're leading 4 participants from 8 different school sites, and I listed some of the roles that are included in that group. I think it's interesting just to see what exactly this community of practice looks like in terms of diversity. So lots of different geographic and racial groups represented, as well as professional backgrounds. So we have some school leaders that are like principal, heads of school, counselors, curriculum, instructional folks. I didn't list this on here, but we also have like an ops person, which is also really interesting to think about how the framework of trauma-informed practices is influencing priorities when you're managing operations at a school. So it's been really exciting. And I think, so as I said, it's a pretty new program for us. Last year was our first year piloting it. And I think we really just, based on surveys and observations of how the sessions went, we realized that the key value add was a balance of both structure and flexibility. So structure, everyone has a day time in the calendar, they're committed to attending, and flexibility of like, it's a pandemic, people have different priorities, things shift, timing gets readjusted, rescheduling, and like relationship building as being a key value proposition for participants. So despite the chaos of spring 2020, I think some of the most exciting wins that we saw come out of the communities of practice were folks who continue to maintain contact and relationships as colleagues after the program had wrapped up. Even among colleagues, I can think of like a couple in particular. One of them doesn't even work at the member school anymore. She's transitioned on, but is still in really close contact with a leader from one of our member schools in New Orleans. And just being able to continue that shared experience of like what is happening now as a new school leader during a pandemic, all that stuff. And then this year, I think we are continuing to learn as well in the frame of continuous improvement. So I think with more time devoted to relationship building, we built in more sessions in our second year, and we're also focused on where we can fit in the balance of ideating and learning. So what I mean by that is, I think particularly in the charter sector and among the folks that are signing up for this, there's a lot of excitement around innovation and trying new strategies, taking things in different directions. And I think sometimes there's also a balance of like attending a PD session and wanting to like walk away with a tangible tool to say like, oh, I have grown in XYZ professional skill, whatever that may be. So I think it is challenging to like get a balance between those, and also finding ways to fit frameworks into practice when we are in an unusual context. So an example, just thinking through, I'm gonna share some materials that were part of one of the sessions with this group. So this, again, the group is centered around tier 1 supports. So thinking about how to support all students and ensure like a safe environment universally. And one of the sessions focused specifically on these 2 domains of emergency management and crisis response, alongside staff self-care and secondary traumatic stress. So the domains and frameworks, it's all within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and how they're envisioning systems for trauma-informed schools. I think there's 9 or 10 different domains. So this session in particular focused on these 2 domains. And what I have here is this chart outlining the cognition cycle. So what happens along this red curve when a student is experiencing a crisis or a trauma response. So at point A, they might be at baseline, focused on task, engaged in independent work or group work, following directions. And then a trigger happens at point B, where there's a trigger and then an early escalation. So some examples of what might be a trigger are like maybe unstructured activities like lunch, or transitioning from recess back into class, an interaction with a particular staff member or a particular peer that might be challenging, and then that leading to an escalation of however that student individually is responding to it. So it could be staring out the window, refusing to comply or participate in classroom activities, fidgeting, a lot of different types of behaviors. And then point C represents like escalation and crisis. So maybe becoming more verbal and refusing to comply with directions, making loud noises, possibly triggering other students, or engaging in behaviors that might compromise the safety of classmates and the rest of the community. So maybe throwing things off their desk, wandering around the room, leaving the classroom. And point D represents kind of de-escalation. So maybe after the crisis point has happened, maybe a student, I don't know, flipped the desk or gotten an altercation with another student, and then they are exiting out of that crisis and maybe feeling this fatigue and like maybe wanting to wanting to reconcile or blaming others, avoidance of discussion. So there's a lot of different ways that behavior plays out. And then the last phase of this cognition cycle is part E, which is recovery. So maybe the student is getting prepared to return to the classroom if they were like sent out on like an office referral or something, or maybe to return to the classroom activities with the whole group. Or they might be more subdued, defensive. Some students experience, again, really strong fatigue in the recovery phase and want to just put their head down on their desk and sleep. So that's kind of what an example of how a student is experiencing a crisis or a trauma response. And then the blue curve represents the responders cycle. So how the adult in the room, the teacher, the paraprofessional, whomever, where they are. Because I think something that is really interesting about this framework is you're noticing that they are, the trigger and the early escalation is happening when the adult is at baseline. So when everything still feels like an environment that is consistent with what's expected and like fruitful. So maybe like the adult in that situation is in a different place emotionally and mentally. So keeping that in mind as they respond to different behaviors. So yeah, this is kind of like a way that we would talk about a trauma response or managing a crisis. Like I said, all those examples that I just listed out loud were in the classroom in that context of an adult or several adults managing a group of students, helping them learn. So one way to think about this further is just looking at like what might school practitioners observe among students experiencing trauma in this school year as opposed to non-pandemic years. So that's a question I would love for us to, maybe, I don't know if we have enough to break into groups, maybe just stay in this whole group setting and discuss, what do each parts of these phases look like? So I'd love to pause there and see if people have any questions or responses to that question. What do these phases look like?
The prompt is also in the chat as folks take some time to reflect on their responses.
Ooh, I see Candace's comment, students not showing up to community sessions when they are synchronous or not completing asynchronous work. Yeah, I've also heard that a lot of members have been talking about that, about that type of disengagement, and like maybe paying even closer to attendance as a form of universal screening and monitoring for potential trauma experience. Has anyone else seen behaviors like that, or other behaviors that we haven't mentioned? Less verbal in group settings. Interesting. Yeah, Mina, not to put you on the spot, but do you have anything you want to voice to that comment?
Yeah, sure. I think everybody responds in different ways. I was just in a classroom where I saw kids less, or virtually viewing a classroom where I saw kids just transitioning in. So I think the new regulations and expectations and how they're supposed to be sitting or how they are, or they're just processing how they're supposed to be safe, but also be allowed to socialize with each other. So I think it's the newness.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I feel like I've also heard from a member this week talking about how staff similarly are feeling like they're in a position where safety and like that heightened sense of like tension is like at the forefront of their minds. So thinking about having to frequently, almost, it feels like policing student behaviors in a way that can be trauma inducing, but at the same time being worried about their own safety. So for example, having to correct the way students are wearing masks or the distance that they're spending, their distance apart that they're spending. So it's a lot to navigate for staff and students. Yeah, does anyone have any other responses that they might have noticed, if not working directly among students, but with staff? Okay, I'm giving a healthy amount of wait time because I know, it's Friday and webinars are kind of awkward sometimes. But I appreciate all of you for spending your time here and continuing to think through what this looks like. I think I've heard a lot too about this week we also had a session related to retention and hiring practices, and thinking through like, okay, with the virtual work setting, how are we creating the culture where adults know that they feel safe, or that the institution, the organization, the school values their safety alongside the needs of students and families. And I think, yeah, I think about this a lot in terms of social emotional learning, and social emotional wellness is not just something that's relegated to youth. I think there's always learning that adults are doing in this space as well, especially in these like unusual times. I know, unprecedented. So it's a lot to definitely think through. And I appreciate folks for sharing. If anything else comes to mind, please interrupt me. I would welcome that. Or type something in the chat. That's great too. So I wanted this discussion also to just kind of be a way that we are taking the perspective of practitioners in a community of practice. So having like a framework that has been used or shared widely in these other settings, in this where self adapted it from this other training, or referring to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and yeah, that's all there. But I think what makes it the magic happen of a community of practice is sharing what's actually going on, and how resource or this list of things to look out for, strategies, how is it playing out in real life? So there isn't exactly a like guide on how to manage trauma during a pandemic or during a time of national unrest in general. So I think it's a lot of iterating as it goes along. Like I was describing it to someone else today in kind of like the pedagogy of the oppressed, if we're thinking about Paulo Freire, and we're not looking for facilitators that are doing this kind of banking model where there are folks who have the knowledge, they are the experts, and they are imparting that on all the school leaders. But it's more just kind of developing and growing together and offering, like the expertise is shared among all of the folks in the room or in the Zoom call. So hopefully that was helpful for kind of visualizing what this type of session would look like in real life. Great. Let me see. And one example of like, hold on a second. Oh yeah, so I think that was some of the biggest challenges with this group. It was thinking about a lot of the experiences of trauma and the literature that's already out there is responding to perhaps individual students or identifying students from the tier 1 to the tier 2 level. And again, those in-person interactions of what observational behaviors you're gonna see is so different when you're in a hybrid model or a virtual model. And I think moving forward, where the participants in this group are thinking about plans for school next year and like what that will entail if teachers are like dividing their attention between supporting the learners in the room and the students who are tuned in online, or what that looks like. So I think it's developing new types of like universal screening methods and also implementing greater space to make sure like staff feel supported and have the resources that they need to identify students suffering from trauma. Okay, so that's kind of where we are in terms of like what we were looking for, the process of a group connecting, reflecting on behavior systems, reviewing data, resources, using the resources to solve, create a strategic plan, moving toward more equitable practices in this trauma-informed way. And the end product, the deliverable we're hoping that groups are developing are, I put some examples here of like a set of mindsets for an inclusive school, or perhaps a staffing flow chart to make sure that there aren't any students who fall through the cracks. So I'll pause here and see if there are any questions so far.
I have a question, but I don't want to interrupt your flow if you are going to take questions later on. So I'm just checking with our presenters to see if now is a good time.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. So I'm really interested in this concept of the community being a place where practitioners can share resources, kind of learn from one another. And you mentioned the role of facilitation a lot. What have you learned about what kinds of strategies do you use to have the participants share with one another in terms of do they bring practices with them? Do they share information about their schools? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I think it unfolds in a few different ways. I think earlier in the year, maybe it's like more concrete, tangible, like homework in between sessions. And hopefully it's like not homework that's in addition to what would be happening on the job, but like maybe the next time that you are on duty or interfacing with this type of student, trying this and like sharing back out how that works. So I think by the time like the following session starts again, a lot of participants are coming with an experience or with something to share, or it's like free work. Like I know one of the groups has a document where they review kind of like a self-evaluation of how trauma-informed are we at this particular tier and what does that look like. So I think a lot of participants come to each session with questions, with learnings, sometimes with some critiques of like, oh, this didn't really work for me, or this isn't quite as good as what we're currently doing, and just adding on to that. So I also think about like the use of the time in session being broken up between breakout groups where maybe like 2 or 3 practitioners will be sharing and brainstorming together. and also using like shared note-taking documents. So something that Sarah and Akua do really well is they will include, when they have breakout groups, they share like a Google slide deck, and they have certain prompts of like, for example, think about a student that you've worked with experiencing trauma, what types of like interventions are most effective at the different phases of the cognitive cycle. And having breakout rooms where the participants are engaged in that conversation, but like we aren't completely missing what's going on because they're also like documenting through like the graphic organizers provided on the shared Google slide. And they can also peek through and see what other groups are getting at. So I think there's a few different ways to make it feel interactive, even though most of the program is virtual.
I think we've all gotten a lot better at that, trying to multitask on the virtual note-taking sheets this year. There's also a question from Sonia in the chat. Will the SELF team continue to check in with the participants after the community of practice is over? And or will participants continue to reach out to each other?
Ooh, yeah, great question. I think for the second question, hard to predict the future, but ideally, yes. And for the first question, so our MOU for these facilitators is just for the duration of the school year. So they start in October, and at the June meeting, they present their final like report or share out or end product resource deliverable. And that lives on our website so that folks can go back, and even if they didn't participate in that community of practice, they can go back and review like what the group learned. Yeah, after that point, like the SELF team isn't like contractually obligated to check in with participants after the COP is over. And of course we want to honor their time and labor that they've already put in. But they are, like I mentioned, the Special Education Leaders Fellowship, they run a lot of programs. So I think even that connection, participants are able to get more engaged if they want to like attend a workshop or do another program with them in a different angle of special education. So I think that's also helpful for us to kind of be involved in connecting folks who are like service providers in this specific topic and other folks who are on the ground, we're running a school. And yeah, like I said with the second question, I can't predict the future, but I would love for participants to continue to reach out to each other. I think that's kind of like the dream. And it has happened in certain subsets of our coalition. I think we grow to, and Seon, you can correct me if this is inaccurate, but we grow to about 10 to 12 new schools in the coalition each year. So there's new opportunities. And I think, especially in recent years, the members that are joining are excited to engage in that way. So it's not like, oh, it's just like an inactive listserv and maybe they hear from someone once every few months. It's really, I think the participant, the type of staff member from a member school that opts into this program is invested in a certain way in the coalition. So they probably will attend other coalition events, they'll probably attend the convening, or they'll reach out to staff if they're like, oh, hey, who did you have that led that one thing? And I think there's a lot of that type of resource sharing more informally in the coalition. So I think communities of practice hopefully is adding like a formalized structure for that to happen. And then more informal connections grow off of that. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Any other questions? Ooh, I see a privately messaged question, probably from someone who wants to remain anonymous. So I won't call them out since, you know, there's very small people, very few amount of people on the call. So, you know, you could deduce who might ask this. But about selecting a facilitator and making sure that the facilitator is a good quality facilitator. That's how I'll phrase that question. How do you know that you're gonna get a good quality facilitator? And yeah, you really don't know. It's a crapshoot. You just pull them out of a hat. No. In the first year, I think we learned a lot with our recruitment process and making sure our RFP got out to a broad audience. But I think it was also, we adjusted the timing for this year to allow for more time for folks to complete a proposal. So now it's open now. It'll be open to the end of the month. And we also have a more in-depth selection process. So I talked a little bit about how, as a staff, we use kind of a committee structure to review the proposals. So I think last year we had like 15 or 20 proposals, and as a team of 5. And I think I also had a member participant who wanted to like participate, like weigh in on some of the proposals as well. We selected maybe like 10 whom we wanted to interview. And I think the interview was really interesting, especially now that I have like been sitting in on that community of practice that has to do with disrupting bias in talent decisions. So like attending the interview, making sure there's multiple people involved, and also offering some type of like performance task so we can kind of gauge, okay, how comfortable is this person on Zoom or with an awkward silence, or how would they handle this situation? Yeah, because as you might be able to imagine, it can be tricky to sustain momentum of a group of school leaders over the course of a year, because our members, are really busy. So some of them, like I mentioned in a previous slide about the roles of folks who signed up, some of them are classroom teachers who are really busy. Others are principals or heads of school, oftentimes pulled into a lot of different directions, if like surprise meetings that are required by the district for an IEP, whatever. So it really takes a strong facilitator to be engaging and ensure that participants are able to prioritize this chunk of time for this specific purpose.
And I think one thing, if I can add on, Amy, to that, and I think this just gives more context to the organization, but also sort of gives an environment for our communities of practice, because I think we're in a unique position being a membership organization and offering other programming. So I think what Amy mentioned is right, in that like programming stems into other programming as well. So when we think about facilitator engagement, Agility, that's doing a COP this year, they had also delivered a session at our convening last year. But a few of our participants in COPs are also Unified Ed host site leaders that's taking on a fellow. So, a lot of our programming is integrated to give folks that experience of being able to connect with other diverse by design school leaders in a number of environments.
So you showing this slide of participants also makes me think of a different question, which is when you talk with participants in the community of practice, what do they, or when you gather some data from them, if you have, what do they say they've gained from being a part of the community of practice? Or if you don't necessarily have data, what do you think they may have gained?
Yeah, so we do have data. We have a survey that we administer after every session. And it asks just a couple quick questions. So every month, from month to month, we can kind of see how participants are experiencing the community of practice. So let me pull that up so you can see as well. So it's really short. And if you are a participant, you select which group you're in and comment on like to what extent you agree or disagree with whether your voice was heard. You've been able to stretch your thinking. The relationships are helpful for professional growth, having tangible next steps for the next session, and competency increase overall. So in a lot of ways, participants are answering these questions based on like the hour I spent with my community of practice this week, and also reflecting on like, well, up to this point, this is how I'm viewing the program and what my experience has been. So yeah, we have a bar of like, okay, we want at the end of this, we want at least this many somewhat or strongly agrees among all of the respondents. And I don't have the results from the first cohort off the top of my head. Seon, do you have that at your fingertips, or anything you can state out?
Yeah, I can definitely put that in the chat. If we're okay to share that, I'll definitely love to share out sort of the first cohort where we were last year. The benefit they took from that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, there've been a lot of really powerful quotes that I've seen. So at the end of the survey, there's like an open-ended section of like anything else that you would like to share. And yeah, people say really great stuff. Usually it's like, oh, the facilitator is great. I can't wait to try this tool. Or I'm really happy I got to connect with so-and-so in our breakout group. We had a really strong conversation about blah, blah, blah. That's given me inspiration. So I think it's been a really nice space for folks to feel inspired. And I think it's so easy, especially now, for a lot of school leaders or counselors to feel burnt out, especially in this very trauma heavy setting that we're still living through. But it seems like in a lot of ways, these relationships are helping folks feel rejuvenated and like inspired by the work.
Great. It seems like from your evaluations that folks were really enjoying the time together and gaining something from those relationships. How do you pick the topics that they talk about? So I know you've mentioned a couple, and this one that we're talking about today is trauma-informed practice. How do you pick the topics of the community of practice?
Yeah, so I think in our request for proposals, here, I'll pull that up too. So that's, so in our request for proposals, let's open in a full screen window. Yeah, so we have some like bullets that are a bit vague. So we didn't say, oh, we want a COP on trauma-informed practices, but we probably said something about like social emotional learning and support as like a general topic. And from there, we kind of select different, we look through the proposals that we have in the pool and say, okay, which proposal seems like it's the most aligned or would be the most of a value add to members. So for example, the first one that, again, and this list of bullets came from a different membership survey, our convening survey. So our convening this year, because it was virtual, had like more than 200 attendees, I think. Seon, you can check me on that if that is an incorrect number, but around 200 people. And of those folks who are members, we sent out a survey afterward, and there was a section of like, if you were to participate in a community of practice in 2021, 2022, what are some content areas that you'd be most interested in or would be most beneficial? Some question like that. And we had, yeah, a bunch of like, checkbox options. People could write in their own options. So that's where this set of bullet points came from. So we have a topic as vague as engagement with diverse families and communities in the context of social action. And maybe we will get a proposal that is about, I don't know, how to engage with families while your community is undergoing gentrification, or how to welcome new families when, yeah, I don't know, more specific versions of that bullet anyway. And we, again, looked through the proposal kind of holistically of like, okay, what contents, what did the person who filled it out, how did they answer these questions? And what do we know about them as a person from the way that they've shared their bio and what their background represents, and how will that add value to being connected with our members?
So I'm asking all the questions if that's okay, but I also want to invite our audience, if anybody else has a question, to please feel free, it's a small group, to raise your hand and we can unmute you. You're all absolutely welcome to ask it out loud, or you can put it into the chat. But I did notice that in your call for proposals, you do have a part about compensation, which I think is really important. And it just sparked a question for me about, what advice do you have for other folks who may not have the resources to be able to pay a facilitator to hold a community of practice? Do you have any suggestions for people who might just want to start with getting teachers together at their school, or maybe working with another partner school? If you don't have a lot of resources to pay a facilitator, bring them in and do these convenings?
Yeah, I think, well, we definitely started out that way in year one. Like the compensation figure that's listed on the RFP now is the largest it's ever been, as we've been able to like grow the amount of support that we're receiving. But yeah, I think if you're working on a smaller budget or no budget, just being really transparent is important. So honestly, I think in year one, yes, we had really great facilitators that we wanted, and we also recognize that they were kind of doing a favor to lead these groups in this way, doing a favor for us, the coalition, to lead these groups at a price point that's probably below what they would normally charge, and being transparent of like, yeah, this is where we are now, and being able to just be honest about that. And like, if you're unable to offer any compensation to a facilitator or someone leading the work, maybe examine like where where you might be able to redelegate responsibilities. But again, I think the core message that I have and is just to acknowledge that it is valuable and like time-consuming work to facilitate, to prepare, and to support leaders in this way. That it's not just like an add-on of like, oh yeah, you're a teacher, so you should do lunch duty too, and you should lead this professional learning group. That like recognizing that that is, yeah, quite substantial of a task.
I mean, even the time and the space to be able to hold the group, right? So you talked about reallocating responsibilities, just providing time sometimes is an important piece and often forgotten. So thank you. Let me make sure.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to make sure, Amy and Seon, if there's anything else that I know we've taken up some time with questions, but if there's anything else that you want to present, or if anybody else has questions.
Yeah, let me just make sure I got through the last set of slides on when we're talking about this deliverable. So we want the groups to produce some type of tangible resource for the field of diverse by design educators. And we have an example from last year, a toolkit that was developed from one of the groups. So again, like I said, last year was a weird year for everyone, but we had the one group that was able to develop this toolkit of different ways to foster a sense of belonging. So yeah, again, this was developed by folks who are coalition members, so school leaders of diverse by design charter schools. And we were excited to share that out with our broader community. So that's what we're looking for kind of as the end goal. But again, like I think process and product are equally really important in the communities of practice experience, the way we have it set up. And as Seon mentioned in the chat, we do have our RFP open. So definitely welcome anyone, or if you could forward it to anyone you know who you think could be a good fit for this opportunity. Yeah, we would really appreciate it.
Great, that sounds like a good moment to pause and see if there are any other questions from any of our participants.
I just have one quick question. As this is in process, I'm interested in the topic of the trauma-informed practices and building capacity for adults. In this toolkit, I saw that one of the toolkits was up from the last cycle. Is this toolkit going to be up for this upcoming cycle? And does it include specifically for like adult support as well as student support in these trauma-informed practices?
Yeah, so because 2020 is behind us, my fingers crossed, we have all the groups on track right now to have some type of toolkit or resource ready to be published on our website by the summer. So in June, they'll kind of unveil what they have. We might collect feedback from other colleagues at their same school site, and yeah, we'll have that ready to share. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll be notified of when that's up and ready to consume. And I think as far as the content of the deliverable, I think that's still a work in progress, but so we have the trauma-informed practices group as one of our groups. The other 3 groups are related to diverse hiring and disrupting bias in the recruitment process. And what was the other one? Oh, creating and sustaining equitable systems through like justice-oriented discipline policies. And another one is, a group of schools in California that our members are working on just different case studies to show their experience with organizational change. So I think a lot of that will incorporate elements of adult learning and how to bring the team along with you, or how to structure like what they decided to do first in terms of, is it curriculum? Is it this other part of school culture? Is it outreach to parents? So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Otherwise, we are at our time here. We really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. And thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.